Hello, everybody. Welcome to my session, A Bug's Life and Apex Debugging Deep Dive. So my name is Brian Leboff. I am a senior consultant at Aperio. I've been doing Salesforce development for about 5 years. I have a bunch of certifications and those things to show for it, but also what I have to show for that experience is I've generated a lot of bugs in my time, and I've had to go down those rabbit holes that we sometimes go in to try and figure out where they're coming from and resolve them. So today what we're going to do is start relatively simple and then get to some more advanced topics in the end. So hopefully if you're a more experienced developer, you'll get some useful info about some of the more advanced topics, and then hopefully I can show you some stuff as well in the simpler sections. And then, but we start from zero, so if you don't have that much experience with Apex development or debugging Apex, you can learn all you need to know right here. So the first thing we'll do is an intro to Apex debugging. Then we'll look at log statements and trace flags. We'll check out the anatomy of a debug log, see what goes into a debug log. We see that big output of information, but we don't always know what all of that stuff means. We'll take a look at filters, some performance debugging tips, code checkpoints, and then I have some next steps and resources that are available from Salesforce. So debugging on Salesforce is a little different than debugging your regular software application. As we all probably know, Salesforce is a multi-tenant architecture, so you have a lot of shared resources. You're using the same instances as other customers, so you can't really stop your code execution. So if you were to stop your code from running, that would stop everybody else's code from running. So since we can't stop a single thread, our main tool for debugging ends up being the debug logs. And so in those debug logs, we get a lot of useful information. We get the code execution. We get any debug statements that we put in the code ourselves. Timestamps if we're trying to do some performance debugging, seeing what's taking long in our code. And profiling information like governor limits and how we're bumping up against some of the Salesforce limits that they set, because we do have that shared instance and environment. So the first thing I'm going to show you guys is pretty simple. We're just going to set up a debug log in our code. So I have a Salesforce instance here, and all that's in here really is a trigger and a utility class. And what that does is when we create a new account, it'll append the state name, or it should append the state name, to the end of the account. So, the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And we can see here it's actually getting appended twice. So that's a bug that we can try and figure out where it's coming from and look at with some of our tools. So if I wanted to analyze what was going on in that Apex trigger, first thing I'm going to do is set a trace flag on my user. So a trace flag is basically telling Salesforce to watch this user and log any code execution performed by that user. So in the new Lightning experience, we go under environments here, logs, debug logs, and I create a new trace flag. And I am the user, can set a time, and we create a new debug log level. So these debug levels, I'll call it Apex debug for now, we can actually set individually what we want to log and how detailed we want to log it. So we have these log categories here and the log level for each of them. And as we change these, we can see more events get added to this list here that are going to get logged. So I'm just going to keep the defaults for now and save that. So now I need to go into my trigger to get it to actually show up in the debug log. And I'm going to put a system.debug statement in there. So this is telling Salesforce to log whatever I put in that statement. So this trigger is getting the account name from a utility class and renaming the account in the before insert action. Yeah, so I just so I want to check that that account name is getting set correctly. So we saw that it was adding two of those state names at the end. So let's make sure that what we're getting back is the right one. And a little trick here, actually, is that this is how most of the time you use your system.debug statements. But as you saw in those trace flags, that you can set the different levels for different code execution. So if you had your Apex code level set to, say, error or warn, you can actually have this output as that level as well. So if you use, if the first argument is one of these logging levels, then your output in your debug log will end up at that level. So this won't actually output at the info level, which is the default. It'll output at the warn level. But we're just going to keep it default for now. And saving. Cool. So now if I go and insert another account, again in the Commonwealth, I can switch back to my logs again, and we should see down in this list that we have a new debug log that was generated. And here's our log. So let's dive into this a little and see what information is actually getting shown in here. Oops. I always forget the command. Let's just do this. Cool, and then these are the different log categories and what kind of non-exhaustive list of what's showing up in the detail levels for each of those log categories. And then that's the list of logging levels. So anywhere from none, which is going to log nothing, to finest, which is going to give you a lot of really detailed log information. Okay, so in our debug log, first thing we see is the header. So the header gives us our version information, and then those log categories and levels that we have set on our trace flag. So in this instance, we have the Apex code category was set to the debug level, Apex profiling, info, and so on and so forth. The next line is always the user info line. So this is the user that executed that action that caused that log to generate. It gives you your ID, your username, and then also the time zone of that user, which I've actually run into issues where I have a batch job that tries to pick things up from a previous day. And when I run it as myself, it was working. I'd run the batch as the user that's running the batch job, and it would fail, and that was because of a time zone issue. So that can be actually sneakily useful sometimes. And then we get our execution and code unit sections. So the execution is the transaction that a lot of the governor limits refer to. So if you see, like, you can have, say, 150 SOCL statements per transaction. That is from execution started to execution finished, which is another event that gets logged. And then beneath that, there's the code units. And the code units are the individual pieces of work within that execution unit. So that's anything from an Apex method, workflows, any of those automated processes, validation rules, all those show up as code units. Yeah, there's a question and answer section at the end, but if you have one, that's.
You mentioned transaction.
Mm-hmm.
150 statements per transaction.
That number might have been wrong. It's 100 queries per transaction.
And when you say transaction, do you mean like a database atomic transaction, or you mean just simply?
So I don't know the exact definition of what Salesforce uses as the transaction, but it's that basically from start to finish of your code execution. And that's actually why this execution started and execution finished, which I think, yeah, at the end here, there's execution finished. That's why those are nice to see in there, because you can see actually what is processing during that transaction that might be bumping up against your limits. Yep. Cool, and then this is pretty much the meat of your debug logs are these line and event info statements. So the first thing on the left here is the timestamp, and that's the timestamp of the current running user, the person that ran the transaction. So that's in their time zone. And then what you may not know is in parentheses here, that's actually the number of nanoseconds since the transaction started until it got to that statement. So that's good for profiling, performance issues. You can see kind of what's taking up all of your time in a transaction. And then this right here is the event. So DML begin is the event that's getting logged there. And then there's detail that goes along with each of the events. And the events are what we showed in the trace flags. If you see more or less events depending on what level you've set. So for example, on the database, if you set to none, we actually wouldn't even see this event in the log. And then here, what I embarrassingly did not know for a very long time in the brackets is the line number of the Apex that executed that. And then additional detail for each event. So each event's going to have different detail in here. For DML statement, it's going to be the operation, type, number of rows, stuff like that.
Is there a format that would tell us that that 15 was the line number?
Yeah, it's in the documentation on Salesforce, but not a lot of people read that. I do sometimes. It's weird. And then at the end of each of your code units, you get this output of your cumulative profiling information. So up until that point, how much of each of these governor limits that you've used up and how much of the resources you've used up so far. So it'll give you your CPU time, heap size, stuff like that, as well as any governor limits you might be bumping into. So that's all well and good from our flat text debug log, but sometimes we need to do a little more digging into what's going on in our code. So most of the time when I'm doing that, I like to use the developer console. It gives you a lot of good information and a nicer way to see things, and I'm going to try and blow this up so we can see a little better. So first thing to note is when you open the developer console, it automatically puts a trace flag on your user. So you have, I think it's called SFDC dev console or something along those lines. That's automatically set on your user, so you don't have to go through the UI, set a trace flag, do any of that. Just open up the developer console, and any execution you run will show up in the log. And you can go into this debug menu up here, down to change log levels. And it's a little slow. But you can see that top line is, this is the one SFDC dev console that it's set on me already. And I can actually change the levels of these as I see fit. So if I want more Apex code information, I can do that there. So now let's go back to Salesforce. Can't Alt-Tab.
How is that different than when you were at the setup part? Setting up the
It's not. So that actually shows up in here as well. It's just a different UI for it, different place to get it. Yep. Cool. So now if I rerun my insert, which hopefully Salesforce cooperates. Come on. Give me 1 second. I'm going to get on a different Wi-Fi. They told me to prepare for this, so I half did. Cool. All right, let's create a new account again. to, because I lost internet connection, it didn't show up immediately. We're gonna have to do that one more time. There. So now we can see in our developer console, down here on the bottom, we get our new log. And we can see since I set the logging level on Apex code to finest, we actually ran up against our logging limit at 2 megabytes, which is the maximum size for one of your debug logs. So if I look in here and I want to find my debug statement, I can check this box. And I can see there my debug statement, and I can uncheck and it'll take me to that line in the code. But there's all this junk up here that I don't really care about. And there's actually a pretty cool thing you can do with the trace flags as well to get rid of all of that. So if I go back to my debug logs and I create a new trace flag, I can put it actually on an Apex class. So if I look at the beginning of this code execution, I can see this is all coming out of my utility class. So I go into Salesforce, I set the trace entity type to that utility class, and I create a new debug log level, and I'll call this none. And then set each of these to none, which is a little tedious. Save that. Save that. And then this time, when I come back in and run it, again in the Commonwealth, get a new log, and we can see that this new log up top is only 6 kilobytes, and that's going to show me the information that I actually wanted to see. So there's actually some good tools additional to this for analyzing some of these bigger logs that you might have. So if you go up to this debug menu again, within here we have different perspectives, and you can set your own perspective, but Salesforce comes with a couple predefined ones. So the first one I'm going to show is the debug perspective. So if I click that, you see we get these two new panels over here. We have the source panel and the variables panel. And then I can click anywhere in this execution log over here, which was the same as our flat debug log file, but just easier to navigate. And it will actually show me the line of source that executed that statement. So I can see for all of these, it's at this line in that utility class. And it'll show you any variables that are there. So if I go into, if I find that debug statement again, I can see I had that account name variable, and it'll actually output the data from that variable. So that's good for analyzing your debug logs, but if you want to see more of kind of what's happening in your code execution, there's this also very cool perspective called analysis. And what this will do is it gives you even more panels, and you can, when you're creating your own perspectives, you can add these and remove them and all that cool stuff. So here we see we have this stack tree panel, our execution log, which is the same as that debug log we've always seen, execution, and the execution stack. So the stack tree, what it's showing you here is a bottom-up view of your code execution. So each of these nodes is one piece of execution. So we can see we have triggers, we had an Apex trigger fire, and then as you go down, you can follow kind of your call stack this way. So I have my account trigger here, which called get account name, which called make noise. So I can show you hiding the classes. Which called add one, if that would open up. Cool. And then in the performance tree panel, it is basically the same thing as this, except it also adds in the number of times each of those was executed. So under make noise, I have a different. That happens sometimes. There's a method called add one that gets executed 10,000 times to make noise, and it would show you that that was executed X number of times. Cool. So we can go back in our analysis. Come on. Boom. Apex trigger. There, 10,000 times it got iterated. And then under here, there's also the execution stack. So this is what was calling what to get to that point. And then there's also this execution overview section, which is actually really nice when you're doing your performance debugging. So you have a piece of Apex that's taking a long time, or you don't know what's taking a long time. This execution overview kind of gives you a visual look at what's happening. So the first thing is the save order. And down here we can see on my account insert, first thing that happened was a trigger followed by a workflow. So that might give a hint as to why we're getting two account names there. These are actually also color coded. So before and after triggers are two different colors. Workflows are purple. Validation rules, I think, are green. Things like that. Sure.
Probably is a dream, but in a multi-tenant environment, is there any chance for a breakpoint?
I will get to that. So we'll see what we can do there. There's also this limits tab, which will, if you have your log level for Apex profiling set to finest, you can get information in here that will show you how much you've used of your limits at certain points. And then the timeline, which is where, which is really useful for performance debugging because you can actually see how long each of your executions taking. So my Apex code here was taking 500 milliseconds, and that's obviously the bulk of my execution. And then this workflow down here does almost nothing. And you can set the scale if you want to dig in deeper or zoom out, that type of stuff. And then there's a summary at the end under the executed units tab, which shows you the total time for each of your methods, or your code units more or less, and number of iterations, how much memory it's using, how much resources, averages, min, max, all that good stuff. And you can filter down here at the bottom if I just want to see methods, or if I don't want to see methods. These are all selected. So now I only get methods. Cool. So now Salesforce doesn't really have breakpoints, but what they do have available in the developer console as well is something called code checkpoints. So code checkpoints allow you to set a point in your code that Salesforce will dump basically the state of the code execution at that point. So if I open up, let's say I was in production and I didn't have a system.debug statement somewhere and I needed to see what was going on with my code. So let's open this up, let's remove that. And I wanted to see what account name was at this point in the code. If I click over here to the left of the line number, hidden feature, I get that little red dot. And what that does is under this checkpoints tab, you can see I have a checkpoint set at line 4 in my account trigger. Now when I go back and run my trigger, saves. You can see in my checkpoints, a new line showed up, and I can open this up, and this is a dump of the variable simple information at that point. So my account name, was test PA. The old account name was still test at that point in the execution, and this is the full information from what was in that account from that trigger. So it's not just, so a lot of the times if you're trying to output a object and you put it in your system.debug statement, you might only get a couple fields before it starts giving you the ... So this is a good way to see all of them at that point. And I also like to use it a lot to compare 2 points in my execution. So if I don't know why something's changing or where something's changing, I set 2 breakpoints, or checkpoints, sorry, and run the code, and I can compare those two and the results from that. And then there's also heap information, so where things are getting stored as well. So that was checkpoints. So let's go back to the presentation. Let me make sure, yeah. Got it. So I lied a little bit when I said that you couldn't set breakpoints in Salesforce code. They actually, as of last year's Dreamforce, have this new tool called the Apex Debugger. And it's a regular live debugger, or more or less regular live debugger, that you can use with Salesforce for an additional license cost. It allows you to use the Force.com IDE to step through your code. So you set a breakpoint as you would any software application and trigger it with anonymous Apex. So I don't think you can trigger it from running code on Salesforce itself, but if you use anonymous Apex within the Force.com IDE and run your code, it'll stop there. You can see your execution call stack, your variable information, and step through your code that way. So that is available if you truly need it for whatever Salesforce charges. So now that we have all these new tools in our tool belt, how do we pick what we want to use? So our log statements, so those system.debug statements, I mostly use for things that I'm going to keep in my code. So permanent logging information, logging exceptions when I'm, say, creating some sort of custom exception handling tool. And I want to make sure that type of information gets output once that code's in production. That's when I'm using my log statements. The trace flags are for setting individual logging levels when you need to log for a particular user, and that kind of tight control on your logging detail level. You do that with the trace flags. Your code checkpoints, most of the time for when I'm looking at things in production or doing some more advanced debugging, I don't want to update the code and put those log statements in. That's when I'm using code checkpoints. I actually use them most of the time, I'd say, for my debugging efforts. And then the Apex debugger, if you have code that might be a little less tolerant to bugs, if you're a partner, ISV, creating an app exchange package, and you need some of that advanced debugging that would come along with that, that's when I would shell out for the Apex debugger. Here is the documentation that I mentioned that Salesforce has, if you would like to jot that down and visit some of those links. It has all the information. It has all the event details, what each detail level will show you, what the right color coding were for the save order, since I probably messed it up, and all that good stuff. And then my Twitter and email as well if you have any additional questions.
Will you post this in the chatter?
Yeah, so this is definitely going into the chatter on the session if you would like to see it. So are there any questions? Sure. It's an additional license from Salesforce, so you just got to reach out to your Salesforce AE support. Yeah. Sure. The live debugger? That I don't know. It's probably not available in production. Yeah. Yep. So in that menu that we saw in the developer console, there's Lightning. So when I was able to set or change the log levels on me, so down here and change log levels, I can also add a trace flag for another user. So here, I guess you have to use the user ID. You can, if you add the trace flag from the UI, then like the Salesforce, not the developer console, then it'll show up in your developer console as well.
Oh, yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so checkpoints would work the same and all that. Sure. What's up? Uh-huh. So that's when the debug log stops logging for that user at 105. If I have the developer console open, it's going to keep that up to date, I'm pretty sure. So you don't have to worry about setting it as long as you have the debug console open. But if the expiration you would set from like the Salesforce setup menu, then once it hits that time, it stops logging for you. Instead of, they used to do like 20 logs and then it was over. Now it's the time.
You really only need to worry about it if you're tracing somebody else, because it doesn't automatically update them.
Right.
Last trace flags always trump user trace flags.
So there is a nice graphic in those documentations that show like how it kind of works. But yeah, so your user trace flag is the first one. And then once it hits the class, if they're raised, then it'll log at that raised level. If they're lower, it'll log at that lower level. And then classes that it may call, if they also have individual trace flags, it'll honor those as well. So it honors probably the class first and then the user, and then down the line from there.
In the list of logs, on those, the time, the log, and you quite odd. But I'm there in different time zones.
Right.
Different time zone. Sometimes it lists some UTC, sometimes we use never. Australia time zone.
Yeah. So I'm not entirely sure what time it's showing down here, but it might be the time zone of the user that executed it, which is maybe because that's what shows up in the log, would be my guess. But yep. So you can't add like system.debug statements to flows, but one of the categories, not what I wanted. One of the logging categories is workflows, and those also cover flows, so you can set that to finest and you'll get some more detailed information there. I don't think there's a way to like set a checkpoint or anything like that for a flow. Yep.
Can I edit those debug statements from the image package? Just generate them from the image package?
I'm not entirely sure on that. I don't think they show up. I don't think I've ever seen, but it might just be managed packages that I've seen don't leave in the system.debug statements, but I don't think so. Sure. So then this expiration, you can reset this.
No, I think if I capture a log, I want to use that for like maybe a couple of days.
From the developer console? Yeah, I mean, I think you'd probably just have to download it. I don't know that you can save them here. Not sure.
Is there a way to program out to enable or create a trace flag?
Yes, so the tooling API allows you to set trace flags. So,
For debugging purposes, you could potentially write some code that automatically creates a trace.
mhm,
Right.
yeah, definitely. Any other questions? I have my last slide. Thank you.